For more on this subject, I want to bring in Brian Cavanaugh now. He's a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a former FEMA official. Sir, good to have you back with us.
Hey, Ben, it's great to be on the show. I appreciate you allowing me to join the audience today.
Thank you very much. There's a lot has been said about FEMA and its response to storms. And I have to admit, I'm very concerned, Brian, because one of the primary things I look at is I look at their website. I go to their website and I see things like FEMA is spending untold sums of cash that they proudly brag about on foreign nationals, for instance, or that FEMA is prioritizing equity as its number one goal. And I'm thinking to myself that, man, they really have their eye off the ball. What do you think, Brian?
Well, I really think you nailed it. I think probably more so than anybody else has in the last several days, that this is fundamentally a flaw of FEMA departing from its mission. You look at the things they've done over the last 3.5 years. They prioritize DEI. They prioritize climate initiatives. Instead of hiring emergency response officials, they're hiring hundreds of DEI and climate advisors, creating climate and DEI task forces across the agency. To me, I just don't understand how that's improving your ability to respond to disasters and making you deliver on the mission to serve and assist Americans before, during, and after a disaster.
So, in other words, something like that has to come with costs. It's not cost free. You can't just add a bunch of frivolous new programs and have no impact on the stuff you're supposed to be doing, your core mission.
Absolutely. And so if you look, since COVID, FEMA's had a high rate of turnover with its personnel. So instead of replacing them with emergency response officials, what I've heard from people who continue to work at FEMA is there's just been this glut of advisors that they're hiring advisors under this weird job series code 0301 in the federal government, which is kind of a catch-all. And they're giving them these titles of DEI advisors, climate advisors. And that's something I was hearing about just this past week, was that they've stood up these climate and DEI advisory task forces. So, I mean, my concern is in 2018, we went on a really big campaign to, I was at the National Security Council at that time, but Brock Long was really trying hard over at FEMA to instill a culture of preparedness, teach Americans what it means to be prepared in light of disasters. And then the other focus was, how do we improve mission delivery to states? FEMA's real mission is to ensure the states have what they need to be able to deliver for their constituents, their citizens. And that's really fundamentally where we've departed over the last several years.
Well, I just want to drill in, though, because DEI is a euphemism for using racial prejudice as a means to decide who gets federal benefits. That's what they're talking about. FEMA's responsibility is to help people in a time of emergency. If you're bringing in so-called DEI experts, what you're trying to do is recalibrate FEMA to be an agency that delivers benefits on the basis of skin color. And, Brian, that is, as I understand it, illegal. The Civil Rights Act makes that exact thing, that exact arrangement, completely illegal. It prohibits discrimination for anyone who receives financial assistance on the basis of race, color, or national origin. What am I missing?
You're not missing anything. In fact, I scratched my head and wondered the same thing, especially when you listen to, there was a recent report that was done with a Congressional Research Service, I believe it was, about, FEMA delivering equity in its responses. And then I was trying to wrap my head around what that even meant. I've listened to FEMA talk publicly about how disasters impact communities disproportionately and differently based on various scorecards you want to keep: race, gender, ethnicity. To me, when I was there for the decade I worked at FEMA, we were about helping Americans. We were about making sure we educated Americans to close the gap on vulnerabilities they had with their resilience and their preparedness. I process over 360 presidential disaster declarations while I was on the National Security Council. And at no point in time did I ever review those with the lens of what race, sex, with gender. That was not a context of what you're evaluating the effectiveness of the disaster request.
Now, I naively thought that the job of FEMA was supposed to be to help the most possible people with the resources that FEMA has. Isn't that what the mission should be?
Absolutely. I think, it leads me to my next thing, which is, over the last 2 weeks, we've heard a lot of the boy who cried wolf when it comes to FEMA resources and FEMA readiness. You go back to a week and a half ago, FEMA's broke. They don't have any money for the next disaster. I think Karine Jean-Pierre said Congress needs to get back from their recess and appropriate funds to FEMA. And I'm sitting there staring at the disaster relief fund report that's available online. And I'm like, okay, you have $647 million in the disaster relief fund's base, which is their account for immediate emergency response to these types of events. And I'm trying to understand where you spend $647 million in this immediate response. It's my understanding they spent around $30 million within a week of Helene. Well, $30 million still keeps you above $600 million.
Yeah.
So I felt like it was a false flag to say they needed Congress to come back and appropriate money.
Well, it was sort of the typical
like a move.
Yeah, it's a very cynical and unfortunate Washington move. The Biden administration specializes in it, which is when people are suffering, exploit that in order to get more money, which it just is an awful impulse because the primary goal should actually be rescuing those people. We still have no idea how many people are actually dead and also missing from Hurricane Helene. I realize the media is moving on from this, but that's a real tragedy. The second highest death toll of a hurricane since Hurricane Katrina, and that's the kind of partisan political behavior we were getting out of the Biden-Harris administration.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a bit of a deliberate move on some people in the administration's on their end, is they know that the news network cycle is going to pass at a given point in time. So all they have to do is kind of bluster until it's moved on to the next issue, which is really sad for the people of Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, and parts of Georgia that are like the most severely impacted by what just happened.
What do you make of the FEMA response in North Carolina to the extent that we can measure it? We heard a lot of reports early on that it was basically civilians who were undertaking their own rescue missions for days, that there was a lot of government impediments imposed on the people trying to conduct those rescues or deliver goods. And then finally, the president came out and said, I'm mobilizing 1,000 active duty troops. And it even took a while for them, the soldiers from Fort Liberty, to get there. How do you score it, Brian?
I have to be honest and say that we probably need to do a better job of management expectation for the federal government when it comes to emergency response. You're looking at it through the lens of a hurricane. So parts of Florida received a pre-landfall emergency declaration, so which means FEMA can surge resources into that area before the storm even hits. What you had happen inland in North Carolina and other states is a no-notice event. It was not something that's predictable that you're going to see something of that scale, a flood hit Asheville, North Carolina. That's not something that was forecasted and predicted. So you don't do a pre-landfall declaration for those parts of the country.
Sure.
So they're going to get their disaster declaration. And then what I say on a no-notice event, the clock for the federal government is really somewhere in the ballpark of 48 to 72 hours when you start to see a robust federal response. It's not meant to upset anyone. I'm just giving you the reality of how it takes to move something as large as the federal government into position.
Yes.
Which is ironic because, and here's where I'm going to say something that kind of strikes me odd. The Cajun Navy, which has been so helpful and so impactful for so many American citizens over the last couple of decades in doing citizen-to-citizen assistance in the immediate hours after an event.
Yeah.
In President Trump's administration, he praised them for closing that gap that he recognized. It's hard to get the federal government to close that 0 to 72-hour gap. And he encouraged, to the extent practical, you encourage and thank them and acknowledge the service they're doing. What we saw in the early days of North Carolina was people being told to stop. We don't want to see civilians helping civilians. It's not safe. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't go in there. And I just thought to myself, that's counterproductive to the culture that groups like the Cajun Navy have really adopted and embraced over the last.
And it's also it's fundamentally anti-American because the conception of this country at its founding is that it is, of the people, for the people, by the people. It's our country, and that the government is supposed to serve some of those broad things that we can't do on our own. But really, it's like, it's us. It's us. And so the government coming in there and acting like, oh, you stupid citizens, how dare you get up in your helicopters and attempt to conduct these rescues? Or stopping Elon Musk's Starlink from being delivered, these terminals from being delivered to people who needed them because, oh, he doesn't have the actual name of the person he's delivering it to. Well, no kidding. He doesn't know how many people. These are strangers who are stranded, and they're trying to get in there and find people to establish connection with them. Government proved to be, in many awful ways, a real impediment to what people needed in this desperate time.
I would say absolutely a fact. And then the other thing is when you talk about, again, management expectation, they talked about $750. We're going to give survivors $750 for this immediate assistance that they need. I feel like that's a little bit of a false advertisement. You have to go apply for it. And the odds are, if you're an insured citizen, you're likely not going to get approved for the full $750. You'll get some smaller percentage of that. We shouldn't be mismanaging expectations on the front end. And I think that was done very heavily.
Yeah.
And I think it also is indicative of I wrote a piece on this last week, failed visible leadership. We just didn't have visible leadership in the early onset of Helene. And if you look at the days before Helene hit compared to yesterday, notice the subtle differences that the administration took to try and put visible leadership out there. I think that was a very widespread common critique was there was just no leadership.
Well, there's a huge difference between the part of this is the Biden administration seems to have anticipated, because we know what the history looks like, that Ron DeSantis is going to be the single most visible subject in the wake in the lead up in the wake of a hurricane like Milton. Because Ron DeSantis is very good at this. He knows the details and he's aggressively responding. And as a state's governor, he's ultimately in charge of that response. It's FEMA that's assisting him there. We didn't see the same thing in North Carolina. Roy Moore is not good at this. Roy Moore has barely been visible during all of this. And so I think a lot of that was really predicated on the way that the governors acted, don't you?
I would agree. I think there's something to be said for having a very visible, strong, and governor who's competent. And, that's something, Governor DeSantis has been doing this for several years. I've worked directly with Governor DeSantis when I was at the National Security Council. He and his team are absolute professionals in how they handle hurricane season. And as a side effect of that, they're really good at handling pretty much any crisis you throw at them. So I commend him for his ability to kind of take command and be visible. And you know what the other important thing is? He's also accountable. I think that's something that can't be stated enough about quality and leadership is accountability. And that has been something that Governor DeSantis has not shied away from.
No, not at all. No, he knows the details. He knows when things are not going well. He acknowledges them and then he fixes. That's not the way Biden and Harris handle stuff at all. Brian Cavanaugh from the Heritage Foundation, former FEMA official. Thank you very much for your insights today. Good to talk to you, sir.